10 animals. 10 animals standing in a desert so barren, so lifeless, that scientists called it a biological dead zone. No shade, no water, temperatures that could hit 50 degrees Celsius by noon. And somewhere out there, predators, poachers, and 40 years of near extinction hanging over every single step those animals took. This is the story of how Oman brought back the Arabian Oryx from the edge of forever. And what happened next didn't just stun scientists. It rewrote everything we thought we knew about nature's power to heal itself. Let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand how extraordinary 1982 was, you need to understand just how close we came to losing this animal entirely. The Arabian Oryx, Oryx leucoryx, is one of the most remarkable creatures to have ever walked the Arabian Peninsula. It's a medium-sized antelope, elegant, almost impossibly white, with two long straight horns that point skyward like spears. Ancient traders who saw this animal from the side, just one horn visible, may have started the legend of the unicorn. And honestly, looking at one, you understand why. There is something almost mythological about the Arabian Oryx. Something that feels like it belongs to another world. For thousands of years, these animals were woven into the cultural fabric of the Arabian Peninsula. They appear in ancient poetry, in stone carvings, in the heraldry of kingdoms. Bedouin tribes considered them symbols of strength and purity. The Prophet Muhammad reportedly admired their beauty. In Oman, the oryx was not just an animal. It was a national emblem, a living piece of identity. But by the middle of the 20th century, that identity was disappearing. Fast. The problem had a name, and it had a trigger. The name was mechanized hunting. The trigger was oil money. Before the 1940s, hunting the oryx was genuinely difficult. These animals lived deep in the deserts of Arabia, places so inhospitable that most humans couldn't follow them. They could detect water sources from miles away. They could survive for weeks without drinking, absorbing moisture from the plants they ate. They could regulate their body temperature in ways that still baffle physiologists. The desert, brutal as it was their fortress. Then came the oil boom. And with the oil boom came jeeps, trucks, and automatic weapons. Suddenly, the desert wasn't a barrier anymore. It was a road. And wealthy hunters from across the region, and beyond, began pursuing oryx the way their ancestors never could. It became a status symbol, a sport, a way to project power. The numbers tell a brutal story. In 1900, hundreds of thousands of Arabian oryx roamed across Arabia, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Israel, and the Sinai Peninsula. By 1930, they were gone from almost everywhere except the most remote corners of the Arabian Peninsula. By 1960, even those populations were collapsing. By the end of the 1960s, wildlife experts were issuing a grim warning. The Arabian oryx had perhaps a decade left in the wild. Maybe less. They were right. In 1972, the last known wild Arabian oryx was shot and killed in Oman's Jiddat al-Harasis desert. The location is almost poetic in its cruelty. The Jiddat al-Harasis is one of the most desolate places on Earth. A vast gravel plain, baking under the Arabian sun, swept by scorching winds, almost completely devoid of visible life. It was here that the last wild oryx fell. The Arabian oryx was extinct in the wild. Now, at this point in almost every other extinction story, we reach the ending. The animal is gone. We mourn. We move on. Life continues without it, and the world becomes slightly smaller, slightly grayer, slightly less wondrous than it was before. But this story doesn't end in 1972. It pivots. Because a small group of conservationists had seen this coming years earlier. And they had done something audacious. In 1962, a decade before the last wild oryx was killed, a man named Ian Grimwood, working with the Fauna Preservation Society, proposed an emergency operation. They called it Operation Oryx. The idea was radical for its time. Capture a small number of wild Arabian oryx before it was too late, and breed them in captivity in facilities far away from the Arabian Peninsula, where they would be safe. It sounds straightforward now. In 1962, it was considered borderline crazy. Capturing wild desert antelopes was technically and logistically nightmarish. Transporting them across continents was expensive and uncertain. And the idea that you could pull an animal out of its native habitat, breed it in a zoo in Phoenix, Arizona, and then one day return it to the wild, that was, to many people, science fiction. But they did it anyway. 3 oryx were caught in the deserts of Yemen. 2 were donated by the ruler of Kuwait. Others came from London Zoo. A small founder population was assembled at the Phoenix Zoo in Arizona, chosen partly for its dry, hot climate. The world herd, they called it. A genetic insurance policy for a species on the brink. And over the next 2 decades, while the last wild oryx were being hunted to extinction, the captive population quietly grew. By the late 1970s, the world herd had expanded to over 100 animals spread across several institutions. The genetic diversity was carefully managed. The animals were healthy. They were multiplying. The question that nobody had quite answered yet was, what do we do next? Keeping animals in captivity forever isn't conservation, it's preservation. There's a difference. Conservation means restoring an animal to its ecological role, returning it to the web of life where it belongs, where it shapes the landscape, where it is shaped by the landscape in return. The goal was always, from the very beginning, to bring the Arabian Oryx back to Arabia. And that's where Oman enters the story. In 1970, Oman had undergone a quiet revolution. Sultan Qaboos bin Said had deposed his father and begun transforming Oman from one of the most isolated, underdeveloped countries in the world into a modern state. And Qaboos, a man of surprising depth and vision, cared about the natural heritage of his country. He had seen the oryx disappear. He didn't want that disappearance to be permanent. In 1977, Oman created the Jiddat al-Harasis Nature Reserve. This is the same Jiddat al-Harasis where the last wild oryx had been killed 5 years earlier. It's an enormous area, roughly 27,000 square kilometers of gravel desert, almost perfectly flat, almost perfectly empty. It looks, honestly, like the surface of another planet. And Oman began working with conservation organizations, particularly the Worldwide Fund for Nature and the Fauna Preservation Society, to plan something unprecedented, a full reintroduction of the Arabian Oryx into the wild. In January 1982, the first animals arrived, 10. Just 10 Arabian Oryx, flown from the San Diego Wild Animal Park, stepped out of transport crates onto the gravel of the Jiddat al-Harasis. They were a mix of males and females, carefully chosen to maximize genetic diversity. They blinked in the blazing Omani sunlight. They sniffed the hot, dry air. They looked, by all accounts, deeply uncertain about what was happening. The team of conservationists watching them was equally uncertain, because everything about this seemed impossibly fragile. 10 animals. 10. In a desert that had already killed the last of their kind, with no guarantee that they could survive, let alone breed, with poachers still a real threat, with the practical reality that nobody had ever successfully reintroduced a large mammal from captivity into the wild on this scale before. It had never been done, not like this. The Harasis tribe, the nomadic people who called the Jiddat al-Harasis home, were recruited as rangers. This was a crucial decision, not just logistically, but culturally. The Harasis had a deep traditional connection to the oryx. Their ancestors had hunted them, yes, but they had also lived alongside them, known their behaviors, respected them. Making the al-Harasis the guardians of the reintroduction program gave the project deep roots in the community. These weren't outside scientists imposing conservation on a local population. The local population was conservation. The rangers monitored the animals daily. They tracked their movements, and the oryx moved, sometimes enormous distances, following the scent of rain, searching for fresh grazing. They reported births. They reported deaths. They reported encounters with predators. The data flowed in from the desert. And in those first years, the results were cautiously, tentatively encouraging. The oryx didn't just survive. They began to do something extraordinary. They began to remember. Now, these animals had been born in captivity. They had never been to Arabia. Their parents had never been to Arabia. And yet, and this is where the science gets genuinely remarkable, they began exhibiting behaviors that could only have been inherited. Behaviors shaped by thousands of generations of desert survival that had somehow persisted through decades of captivity. They spread out across enormous ranges, exactly as wild oryx traditionally had. They detected rainstorms from distances of up to 60 kilometers and moved toward them, following weather patterns that no human observer had taught them to follow. They formed the same social structures, dominant males, harems, all bachelor groups, that had been documented in historic wild populations. They dug in the shade of sparse desert shrubs, cooling themselves through behavioral adaptations that their zoo-born parents had never needed. The desert, it seemed, was already inside them. They just needed to be returned to it. By 1988, 6 years after reintroduction, the wild population had grown to more than 100 animals. Scientists began revising their models. The recovery curve was steeper than anyone had dared to predict. But then, in 1996, the story hit a devastating wall. Poaching returned. In the early 1990s, demand for oryx in private collections across the Gulf had surged. Wealthy individuals wanted these animals, not for conservation, but for private menageries. And the wild herd in the Jiddat al-Harasis was an easier target than breeding programs in distant countries. Between 1996 and 1999, the wild population crashed from roughly 400 animals back down to fewer than 100. Rangers were threatened. Animals were shot or captured. The entire project, 15 years of painstaking work, 15 years of cautious optimism, seemed to be unraveling. It was, for everyone involved, a moment of genuine despair, but Oman didn't give up. They expanded ranger patrols. They established stricter legal protections. They worked with neighboring countries and international organizations to crack down on the illegal trade. And critically, they began expanding the breeding program, maintaining multiple insurance populations, both within Oman and abroad. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the poaching pressure eased, and the population began to climb again. By 2011, the Arabian Oryx wild population across the Arabian Peninsula had grown to over 1,000 animals. That year, the International Union for Conservation of Nature made a historic announcement. The Arabian Oryx was being downlisted from extinct in the wild, the category that had applied since 1972 to vulnerable. It was the first time in history that a species which had been classified as extinct in the wild had recovered sufficiently to be downlisted. Read that again because it matters. The first time in history, ever. Not just a recovery, a record. Today, the numbers tell an even more remarkable story. Wild populations of Arabian Oryx now exist in Oman, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Israel, Jordan, and Bahrain. In Oman alone, the wild population in the Jiddat al-Harasis has grown to well over 600 animals, with additional populations in other protected areas. The global wild population is estimated at over 2,200 to 1,500 individuals, with thousands more maintained in managed breeding programs. The Arabian Oryx has been reclassified from vulnerable to endangered, which sounds like bad news, but is actually a sign of ongoing monitoring and nuanced assessment rather than a reversal of the recovery. The populations are considered stable and in several areas, genuinely thriving. But here's the dimension of this story that gets less attention than it deserves: what the Oryx recovery did for the desert itself. The Jiddat al-Harasis doesn't look dramatically different to a casual observer. It's still flat, still harsh, still a place where the sun can kill the unprepared. But ecologists who have been studying it for decades know that something has changed beneath the surface. When large herbivores move through a landscape, they shape it. They graze in ways that control the growth of certain plants, allowing others to proliferate. They move seeds in their gut, depositing them across huge areas, changing the distribution of plant communities. They create disturbances in the soil that affect how water infiltrates after rare rains. They are, in the language of ecology, keystone species, animals whose presence has effects disproportionate to their numbers. The return of the oryx to the Jiddat al-Harasis triggered what ecologists call a trophic cascade. Plant diversity increased in areas grazed by oryx. Other species, birds, reptiles, small mammals, began appearing or increasing in numbers in areas where the oryx were concentrated. The relationships, the connections, the web of ecological dependency that had been quietly fraying for decades began to knit itself back together. The desert, which scientists had called biologically dead, was not dead. It was dormant. It had been waiting. This is perhaps the most profound lesson of the Arabian Oryx story. Ecosystems are not as fragile as we sometimes assume. They are also not as resilient as we might hope. They occupy a middle ground that is deeply conditional. They can absorb an enormous amount of damage and then recover given the right inputs at the right time. The right inputs, in this case, were 10 animals and the human commitment to protect them. The story also changed conservation science in ways that reverberate today. The Arabian Oryx reintroduction became the template, the proof of concept, for dozens of subsequent large mammal reintroduction programs around the world. The techniques developed in Oman for monitoring, for managing genetic diversity, for engaging local communities as stakeholders rather than obstacles. All of these became standard practice. When wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone in 1995, conservation scientists looked at what had been done in Oman. When the scimitar horned oryx, a different species extinct in the wild since 2000, was reintroduced to Chad in 2016, the playbook came partly from the Jiddat al-Harasis. When conservationists in India worked on Project Tiger, in South Africa on rhino protection, in Australia on quoll recovery, the foundational thinking traced back, in part, to those 10 animals that stepped off a transport crate in the Omani desert in January 1982. There's something almost philosophical about this. We talk a lot in conservation about the cost of action. The money, the time, the political difficulty, the competing priorities. And the costs are real. The Omani Oryx program required sustained government commitment, international cooperation, expensive logistics, dangerous fieldwork, and decades of patient, unflashy work. There were no guarantees. There were terrible setbacks. There were moments when everything seemed to be falling apart. But consider the alternative cost. Consider what the world would have lost if the Arabian Oryx had been allowed to disappear entirely. Not just the animal, though the loss of this specific creature, this ancient, elegant, ecologically vital creature, would itself have been a tragedy of incalculable proportions. But also the knowledge we gained from its recovery, the techniques developed, the precedents set. The other species that will survive because we learned what we learned in the Jiddat al-Harasis. Extinction is not just the loss of one species. It is the foreclosure of possibility. It removes from the world not just what the animal is, but everything the animal could have taught us, everything its ecosystem could have become, every connection it would have maintained, every chain of life it would have sustained. And the reverse is also true. Recovery is not just the restoration of one species. It is the reopening of possibility. It is saying, this door, which we nearly allowed to close forever, is open again. What happens next is up to us. Sultan Qaboos, who championed the Arabian Oryx recovery throughout his reign, said something that has stayed with conservation scientists who heard it. The land and the people are one. To abandon one is to abandon the other. He died in 2020, having watched the animal his country brought back from extinction become a symbol not just for Oman, but for what the modern conservation movement can achieve when it commits with enough sincerity and enough patience. The Harasis Rangers, who were recruited in 1982, are now in their 60s and 70s. Many of them have sons and daughters who have taken their places in the desert. They have spent their working lives with these animals, watching calves born, tracking movements across the gravel plains, standing guard through the difficult years when poaching threatened everything they had built. Ask them what it means, and many of them will point to the horizon. Sometimes, if you are lucky, you can see a small white shape in the distance, moving steadily across the flat gravel, hunting for rain. An Arabian Oryx, wild, in the desert where it belongs. That shape in the distance is not just an animal, it is a rebuke to despair. It is evidence that the hardest problems, the problems that seem utterly solved, permanently closed, ecologically final, are sometimes not final at all. 10 animals in a dead desert, and what they did next stunned the scientists. What they did was live. If this story moved you the way it moved me, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The world is full of stories about things we've lost, and we should honor those losses. But the Arabian Oryx reminds us that there are also stories about things we've chosen to bring back. Those stories deserve to be told just as loudly. Hit the like button if you believe conservation work like what matters. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the moments when humanity decided to do something difficult and beautiful instead of taking the easy way out. And drop in the comments, which other extinct in the wild animal do you think deserves its own comeback story? Because there are a lot of them, and I want to know which ones you care about. I'll see you in the next one.